Good morning. Thank you for attending a Rancho Mirage Writers Festival. Please welcome Dr. Gregory Berns.
Thank you. And thank you for coming out to the first talk of the festival, and it's really an honor to be here. And so to get right to it, I assume everyone here is a dog person, otherwise you wouldn't have come, right? Okay. Any cat people here? Well, you raised your hand for dogs too, right? So that's okay. So this is actually the first of two talks I'm giving. So the one tomorrow is similar to this, so I'm just kind of giving you a heads up if you're really into dogs. What I want to talk about this morning is how this project began and give you kind of a sense for what we're trying to accomplish in understanding and decoding dogs' thoughts and feelings. And tomorrow what I'm going to talk about is going beyond that and trying to infer what other animals think and possibly feel. So hopefully this will give you a little bit of the taste of this. The book up here, How Dogs Love Us, was actually the first book I wrote about this project. And so just to tell you a little bit how I got into this, prior to working with dogs, my main gig was studying humans. So I'm trained as a scientist, an engineer, and also a psychiatrist. And for most of my career, I used brain imaging technology, specifically MRI or magnetic resonance imaging, to try to figure out how the human mind works. And for almost 20 years, I used that technology to have pretty much normal, healthy human volunteers go in the scanner and have them do various types of cognitive tasks, mainly focusing on things like reward and motivation, essentially what makes us do things. And that later became a field known as neuroeconomics. So think of that as the neuroscience of decision making. And then something happened now back in 2011, so this has been going on almost 7 years. And the catalyst, to be honest, was the bin Laden mission. And I feel fairly safe in saying this, that I am probably the only person who had this reaction to that mission. And what happened was, as many of you know, there was a dog on that mission. Later, it came out that the dog's name was Cairo, a Shepherd or Malinois mix. And when that came out, I saw these pictures in the media of all these military working dogs doing amazing things, things like jumping out of helicopters with their handlers. And the thought that I had, and this is the one I'm pretty sure I'm the only person who had this reaction, was if dogs can be trained to jump out of helicopters, we can certainly train them to go into MRI machines. So then the natural question is, well, why would you want to do that? And so my thought process was, well, so we can figure out what they're thinking and feeling. Right? And so that was the genesis of what became the Dog Project. And it literally was a kind of crazy idea. It was a side project really for the first 2 years until we got it going. It was an idea with in search of a question. First it was just, can we do this? And then it became apparent, as I'll show you how we did it and what we began to find, that once it was apparent that we could do this, and not only was it possible, that it actually turns out to be easier than you might think, that all sorts of questions started coming to the surface, and this idea that we could actually get into a dog's mind and not just project our own thoughts and feelings on them in a scientific way. And so that's really what this project is about. So to get to the original question of what is a dog thinking and feeling, I go to my favorite philosopher, Gary Larson of the far side. And so in this cartoon, you can see how to recognize the moods of an Irish setter. So I think the Irish setter dates it a little bit. I remember growing up knowing families that had Irish setters, but honestly, I haven't seen an Irish setter since I was a kid. So replace Irish setter with golden retriever, and I think you have the same sense of this. And so here's the problem. So how do you know what a dog is feeling? How do you know that they have these emotions at all? Or are they just our projections of it? So this is the conundrum. And it kind of clashes a little bit with our own common sensibilities of living with dogs. So here's a dog who is, I don't think anyone would doubt that this dog is enjoying what it's doing at the moment, and that's catching a Frisbee. And so you could take that as kind of a sign of joy or happiness to a dog. And similarly, I don't think anyone would have any difficulty recognizing that this dog is not happy. If I were to read that expression, it would probably be one of fear or anxiety for sure. And so right at the outset, even, certainly the dog people here, which is everyone, has no problem recognizing that dogs have these emotional states. And I would say actually most people don't have any difficulty, whether you're a dog person or not. You can recognize when an animal is, for lack of a better word, happy or sad. And then you get into displays like this, which become much more complex, right? So what is this dog experiencing? Is it a sense of loyalty? Is it a sense of love, even, in kind of any connotation of the word? So love is very difficult, and in fact, that is in part why I titled my first book, How Dogs Love Us. And I will say, oftentimes, for whatever reason, I'm not sure why my books tend to provoke this reaction in publishers. Every publisher I've had has wanted to phrase my book titles as questions. So, and this is kind of an interesting argument that we always go through, this exercise where a publisher says, why don't we title your book, Do Dogs Love Us? And to which I respond, I will not ever title any book that I write as a question. I'm not interested in posing questions. I'm interested in trying to answer them. So this project then became an effort to answer that question. Now, when you talk about dogs' motivations, whether it's just to anyone who lives with a dog or whether it's scientists, you quickly realize that everyone is an expert in dogs. So one of the common scientific criticisms of much of this research goes all the way back to the early psychological behaviorists. Actually, it goes back to Pavlov himself, who did the first experiments in dogs, which gave rise to much of experimental psychology. And the critique of intuiting what animals or dogs feel or think is based primarily on the criticism that, well, you can't ever know what an animal thinks or feels. You can only observe their behavior. And, when it comes to dogs, how do you know that everything that they do is simply motivated by the fact that we feed them and they live with us? So we give them shelter, we give them food. Maybe, not saying this, they do this consciously, but maybe everything they do is kind of a behavioral program to elicit emotions from us, and they themselves don't feel anything like we feel. It's just, maybe it's not even conscious, it's just automatic. They behave in a way that causes us humans to be nice to them, which of course would be very much to the dog's advantage. And so I posed this kind of rhetorical question, is it all a scam? And so this was the question that kind of began to consume my life after I hatched this idea to try to scan dogs. And it was really the question that I was trying to answer, which is, why do dogs do what they do? Why do they behave the way they do? What is in it for them, apart from the food? Do they have anything like emotions like we do? And so that was kind of the overriding question. Okay, so if we're talking about humans and we want to know what a human is thinking or feeling, we have two options. We have the possibility of asking them, what are you thinking? What are you feeling? Sometimes we will respond. Sometimes people will tell us, if we know. Sometimes we don't know necessarily what we're feeling. We can't access those emotions. Sometimes we're not truthful. But generally speaking, we're fairly transparent. We have the facility of language to communicate thoughts and feelings, and that is very much a human ability. And then you also have the ability to observe actions, and from that we infer how a person is feeling or what they're thinking. And that's pretty much it until modern technologies came along and give us the possibility of looking inside the brain to try to infer what's happening there. So when it comes to dogs, of course, the language part is taken off the table. So although we speak to them constantly, as a matter of fact, they don't generally talk back to us, at least not in human language. So that leaves us with observing their behavior. And this is very problematic. So we go back to the Gary Larson cartoon. It's very difficult to really understand what another animal is thinking or feeling simply from observing behavior. Now, there's some basics I think that we can agree on, which those pictures illustrated, but then it gets very difficult, and it becomes very difficult to separate our own thoughts and our projections of those thoughts and feelings onto an animal, which is called anthropomorphism. And so that has always been the problem in trying to understand animal thoughts. And that is why most scientists, most science does not really attempt to go there, because it's just fraught with so many interpretation difficulties. And so it was kind of against this backdrop that I wanted to go directly inside the brain and do what we do with humans and understand what a dog is thinking and feeling by essentially decoding their neural activity. And that's when we bring in the heavy equipment. So this is an MRI machine being installed in our psychology building. And so it looks kind of like a jet engine. Okay, so that's the background to it. Now, I do want to emphasize that this, when I start talking about animal research, that kind of sets off all sorts of alarm bells with most people. And I'm not going to defend the history of animal research in this country or anywhere, really, because I think, honestly, that most of it has not been kind to the animals. So when we set out doing this, as a dog person and dog lover myself, I wanted to do it in a very different way. I wanted to approach this as a collaboration with the dogs themselves and treat them very much like we treat people who volunteer for research. And there's a whole raft of rules and regulations regarding medical research in humans, mostly pertaining to the fact that when someone volunteers for a research project, it has to be done of their own accord. They have to do it willingly. You can't coerce them. And they always have the right to refuse to participate. So we wanted to do that with dogs. And so the idea was we would not hurt any dogs. We treat these dogs as family members. And in fact, my dog was going to be the first one to try this, and I would not ever do anything to hurt her. Critically, we would not restrain them in any way. So we're not going to use physical restraints. We're not going to use chemical restraints, meaning sedation. So if you restrain a dog either physically or chemically, then by very definition, it can't be voluntary for them. So the whole idea was to have them voluntarily participate in this project. We'd only use positive reinforcement. We would not do anything to punish them or hurt them. And importantly, this would be a community science project. So when it started, it was just me and my dog and actually one other dog. And then as you'll see, it kind of grew into this citizen science project. And so the reason I bring that up is most research done at universities is done using animals that are specifically bred for research, and they do not have a good quality of life. So we wanted to reach out to the community and do this, and do it with pet dogs, and have fun doing it. So how do you do this? Well, if you've had an MRI, you know that an MRI is not a pleasant experience for most people. It's claustrophobic for people. It's because it's a tube, and it's quite loud. So many of the challenges that exist for humans to get an MRI also exist for dogs, although they're not necessarily the same in the sense that the same things bother dogs and maybe different things bother dogs. But the critical requirement is you're not supposed to move. So if you've had an MRI, you know the MRI tech goes, okay, they oftentimes don't tell you much. They just put you in the tube and they just say, hold still. And then the thing just starts making this god-awful sound, right? They're incredibly loud. And so that is quite a challenge for a dog because they're not going to understand, don't move straight away, and they're not going to understand the sound that the scanner makes. It's enclosed, so that makes people claustrophobic. Another aspect that is potentially an issue for dogs is that it's elevated, so that it's on a table. And so we had to kind of tackle each of these problems and figure out how to solve them. So, as I said, this started in 2011. So, the top dog, Callie, is my dog. She was adopted from the Atlanta Humane Society about a year before and was just kind of hanging out at my house. You can see she's actually a terrier mix. The other dog, Mackenzie, is a border collie, and she happened to be the dog of a trainer that I worked with. And so when I had this idea, I reached out to a dog trainer that I knew and told him the idea, and we started just brainstorming, how are we going to do this? And the answer is we simply broke down the process of an MRI into component pieces and taught the dogs each element by itself and then started adding them together. So that entailed building a simulator of an MRI. So this is Andrew Brooks. He was a grad student in my lab, and much of this was done in my garage. We sourced parts from construction yards to build an MRI simulator. And so that is our simulator of an MRI tube. It's the same diameter, and there's a patient table in there. That's me modeling what's called a head coil. So that's the thing that picks up signals from your brain, and that's me demonstrating it for Callie that eventually she's going to have to go in that thing. You can't really see it in the picture, but I have peanut butter on my lips. Okay, so this is a short video. This is like a 5-minute video, which is a training video that we filmed as we went along, and it gives a sense for how we actually do this. So there's a little bit of sound, and I'll narrate as we go. So it begins on literally the first day that we started the training. So that's Callie, and that's Mark Spivak, the dog trainer I work with. And what he's doing, so Callie has not seen this contraption before other than me modeling it, and he's using a clicker to try to teach her to go into this little contraption, and then she gets a little piece of food. The clicker just is a way of shaping behavior, and it tells the dog, yes, you've done the right thing. And so the thing to pay attention really is she's having fun doing this. I mean, she's having fun trying to get the hot dog, but the thing around her head is kind of beside the point at this level.
Excellent.
So this is Mackenzie. So she was already highly skilled. She was trained in agility. And as you'll see, she is much better at this. This is kind of trivial for her. Callie had no other particular skills.
Good girl. Lots. Yes. Is she too far up now?
Yeah, basically we're looking for the brain thing,
Yes.
the brain case to be in the center of it. Right there. That's good. No, you're not doing this.
Lots.
Ultimately, the dogs are going to have to hold absolutely still without movement more than about 2 millimeters. And so when we started, it seemed like an impossibility. And even at this stage, I didn't know. But then Mackenzie did this. And I realized we're going to be able to do this. She's still moving too much, but the level of intensity and concentration is remarkable. It's typical of a border collie, but still. Okay, so this is probably a couple weeks later. One of the things I realized was, we can't just ask a dog just to kind of hover their head in air like that, that we needed to give them a target to put their head on.
Perfect job.
So we started with these little foam bars. These are these are the only home videos that I film. Okay, so this is Mackenzie. Also, probably a couple weeks later, you can kind of also make out that she's in the MR simulator. Doing much better. It's still too much movement, but we're getting there. Okay, so I had mentioned the noise that a scanner makes. So the way we approached that was we just simply recorded an MR running the sequences that we would use.
Excellent job, Miss.
And I just started playing them at home. So this is me practicing with her in the basement
Excellent.
with this noise running in the background.
Very good.
And the idea was they don't know what this sound is. As long as we make this a fun game, they should associate that sound with fun. So this is now probably a month into it, and this is at the real MRI. This is probably the most expensive training session ever because I had to pay for the scanner time, so it was about $500 an hour for this.
There you go. Good girl. Perfect.
We had taught the dogs to go up the little steps because that was a key component of making this voluntary, that they have to walk into the scanner themselves.
Oh, good for you.
The idea was that not only is that voluntary, but if they walk in, then they also know that they can leave.
Excellent. Very good.
On the second trial, Callie went right up the stairs.
Okay, so this is kind of in the end. This is back at home with me practicing with this thing in my living room. This simulator lived in my living room for about 2 years. So at this point, we've kind of been modifying things. We modified the chin rest. It kind of fits. It's custom fitted to their muzzle, so it gives them good feedback where to put their heads. You can also make out that she's wearing little ear muffs, so we want to protect their hearing from the scanner noise as well. And I've introduced hand signals, and so this was the very first thing that we did. This hand signal means reward, means you're gonna, if you hold still, you're gonna get a treat. And then the other hand signal looks like this, which is just a control signal that essentially means nothing. And so it looks simple, and I don't want to say it's simple, but it's not as complicated as we thought it would be initially. And so this is the end result of about 2-3 months worth of training. And it's not a lot. Once we figured out how to do it, then we just kind of like took it to the streets. You know, we put out kind of word of mouth. It's like, hey, we're starting this project. Do you want to know what your dog's thinking? Come volunteer. We will teach you how to train your dog for an MRI and boldly go where no one has gone before, we hope. So it then at that point, it started to explode. So we recruited kind of a first group. We started kind of with the military tradition. First, we started with the A team, and then we kind of had Bravo Company, Charlie Company, and so on. And so even to this day, we recruit people and hold MRI class every other Sunday, and we have tryouts. So over the years, we've now trained and scanned close to 100 dogs. They're not all active in the project anymore, but we have about 25 that have remained active in Atlanta and have participated in a dozen different sessions, experiments to try to figure out what they're thinking. And so this is kind of just a sampling of those dogs. These are just some cheesecake shots of going in the scanner. All the dogs get wrapped around the head to keep their ear protection in place. That's all that is. With the ear muffs, they tend to kind of fall down around the neck. Some dogs, we actually teach them to wear earplugs, the same as people. And again, we wrap the ears so they don't fall out. And that's what it looks like from the business end, as we say, in the scanner. These are all different dogs, obviously. And that dog's name is Katie. She's one of our favorites. She's been doing this. She's a member of the A team. She's been doing this since we started and is absolutely one of the best dogs at this. And what's interesting is after they do the first session and they come back for other experiments, it's very difficult to keep them out of the scanner. They come, and then oftentimes they're in there before we're even ready to go. So it's very gratifying to work with dogs in such a collaborative way and that they like doing this. Okay, so to get to the question of what this talk is about, which is do they love us, I have to give you a little bit of science and some of the results. So when we started, we had these two hand signals, and this is very much straight Pavlovian conditioning. So this is what Pavlov did, except not with a bell. We're using a hand signal, right? So this, you hold this up, the dogs have learned when they see that hand signal that they will get a treat. And so that creates a state of anticipation for them. Now we know a lot about mammalian brains and what parts of the brain are associated with that. It's generically called the reward system. I will give you a little bit of anatomy lesson here. So dog brain on the left, this is not to scale, but I blew it up for easy comparison. So a dog brain is actually about the size of a lemon for a sense of scale, depending on how big the dog is. Now, when you look at it this way, you can immediately see that there are many similarities and there are many differences. So you can make out, I usually would point to it, but you can make out the spinal cord coming up into what's called the brainstem. That is clearly pretty much the same in both humans and dogs. And the parts that are actually quite different are the folds, the cortex, as we say. And the main differences there are obviously the size. So humans have a much bigger cerebral cortex. It's more folded. And what that means is that there's just more surface area. Some of that is related to body size. So we know that larger animals have larger brains. That in and of itself is not terribly interesting. Then you get into specifics of, well, is a brain large for a body size? So humans have a very large brain to body weight ratio. Dogs are a little bit above average. Cats are very average. And then you get into the specific parts of the brain. And that's where much of the science is that we're trying to understand, which is what are the similarities in that cortex? Can we find analogous regions in the dog brain to human brains? And so what that entails is doing the same types of experiments that we do in humans to understand human brain function and simply adapting it to study in dogs. And so the idea is if we do something similar in a human and a dog, and we find a pattern of activation that is essentially similar, then from that we conclude that there's a high likelihood that they are experiencing something similar as we do, even though they might not have the words to describe it. One of the key areas when we're talking about reward is the structure that I have highlighted with an arrow. It's a structure, the anatomical name is called the caudate nucleus. And what you need to know about that is it's the part of the brain that is richest in dopamine receptors. So dopamine is a neurotransmitter that for decades has been associated with things like pleasure. That's not quite correct to call it a pleasure neurotransmitter. It's more properly associated, I would say, with states of anticipation, things that put you in a state of readiness to do something. And that may be associated with something good, or it may be associated with something bad, and you just have to get out of there. And so this structure sits kind of at the interface between the cortex and the motor system. And so it's the key structure for motivation and action. Now, in the context of everything that we do, we think that it's pleasurable because the dogs are getting fed and they're getting other things that they like. So when we see activity there, we interpret that as a positive emotion. So when we did the first experiment, this is just the results of the very first two dogs, Callie and Mackenzie, and we compare the brain response of these two hand signals, this versus this. This highlights an area of activity shown in orange, which is associated with that area. In fact, it's pretty much the only area of their brains that was active. So all that has told us is that the technique works, because this is not a surprise that dogs like hot dogs. When we expanded that into more community dogs, and we do something where we can average the results together into what's called a brain atlas, it gives us more power to see how generalizable that result is. It's the same idea here, where the color, the redder it is, the more statistically significant, the more active that region is. And so this is the same experiment now in a dozen dogs, just averaged together. So this tells us that the results with the first two were not just a statistical fluke, but it really does seem to be a general property of dogs and the fact that they like hot dogs. Again, no surprise there, but the point is that it's critical to understand that the technique works, that the dogs, in fact, are holding still enough that we can collect data while they're doing this, and that the response that we get is interpretable to us as the scientists, because this is the result that you would expect for any animal, any person getting something or anticipating something that they like. Okay, so that gives us kind of a roadmap for where to look for now the more interesting questions. And this is probably 2 or 3 years worth of work at this point, going from the initial crazy idea to demonstrating kind of a proof of concept and feasibility, to recruiting communities, dogs, and volunteers to get to this point. All right. So one of the things that we did next was we looked at the response to odors. And this was kind of a very crude experiment. It was the first one, as far as I know, where instead of using hand signals, we actually presented the dogs with scents, odors. And the odors were, as you can see, it was the odor of a familiar human in the household. It was the odor of a human that they had never met before. It was the odor of another dog in the household, a strange dog, and their own odor. Now, everyone wants to know where we got the odors. So the human odors were underarm wipings. Oftentimes we would ask the people not to wear deodorant for a day and then go work out, whatever, and then we would give them a gauze pad, and then we'd get that. And then the dog odors were basically butt wipings. And it fell to my graduate student at the time to take all these pads and cut them up and put them on the end of a long cotton swab like that to present to the dogs. And so Katie here is modeling that, but this was done in the scanner. And so then the idea then was we would use that response in that caudate nucleus as kind of a gauge of how rewarding or how exciting that smell was to the dog. And so we compare the different odors. And so we can divide it kind of into 2 responses. We can find an area that responds to all the smells, and that is the olfactory area of the brain, which is kind of towards the nose, or on the left it's towards the top there. And then we look in the area of the caudate, the same area I showed you that responds to the hot dogs, and we've actually found that it was the smell of the familiar human that evoked the strongest response there, which was kind of surprising because we expected it to be the familiar dog, but it was actually the familiar human. And so this was really the first indication to us that, one, the dogs kind of can parse out the different smells, which is not terribly surprising, but it's good to find evidence of it, but that their reward response was really reserved for the human, not the dog itself. And maybe kind of in hindsight, the reason for that is most of the dogs that lived with each other were unrelated to each other. So there's not any reason to expect that dogs living in the same household are necessarily friends with each other. In fact, they might be competing for our attentions. So the smell response seemed to be reserved for the familiar human. So now we're getting close to the question of love, if you want to call it that. So another experiment that we did to kind of pursue this is, well, do they recognize us? Do they recognize human faces? So the background of this experiment is it's been known for 20 years that in human brains, and actually any primate brain, so chimpanzees and monkeys, have large parts of the visual system devoted to processing faces. And the definition of a face processing area to a neuroscientist is finding a part of the brain that is active when you show a face, but not something else. So the something else could be like an object, or as you see here in these pictures, it could be an everyday object, it could be a picture of a natural scene, or it could just be a scrambled image. And so the usual way you do these experiments in humans is you have a human in the scanner and you just show them pictures like that. And in fact, those pictures were taken from a human experiment. We simply did the same thing with the dogs. Show them the same pictures. This actually was one of the most difficult experiments that we've undertaken. And the reason is because dogs are not generally interested in images. Not many dogs will watch TV. a few do, and even then it's only transient, usually when an animal appears on the screen. So not all the MRI dogs were interested in doing this experiment, and the reason I know that is because we had to put a screen at the end of the scanner bore and project these images, and some of the dogs, after about a minute of this, just like, I'm done, and then they would leave. And it's not one of these things where you could have the human there to coax them back in, because then they would see their face. So in the end, about half a dozen of the dogs completed it, and we were able to identify, and sorry, this is kind of the geeky science part, we were able to identify a part of their visual system in the top part, the top row, that identified an area that responded to pictures of faces, but really nothing else. And then the bottom row is just their visual cortex, as we say. That is kind of analogous to the area that just sees images and becomes active. The other one, the top row, is the part of the system that is very specific to processing faces, and it's either dog or human faces. We don't know if there's a difference yet. And so this was quite amazing, because for the first time we identified in another animal a part of their brain that really is dedicated to processing faces, and that had only been seen in primates before. And so this is quite amazing, and it shows either through evolution or from just being around us, being raised in human households, that dogs do attend to our faces. It's important information for them. Okay, so the last experiment I'm going to talk about is kind of the closest I can get to answering the question of, do dogs love us? And this became known as the praise versus food experiment. So here's Katie, our favorite model dog. This is in our simulator. And this is a short video clip. So this is, again, this was done in the scanner. So for this experiment, we can't use hand signals, because as you'll see, we want to know. This is a hairbrush, which is just a control stimulus. Nothing happens after this. Okay. The next one you'll see is another toy held up on a stick. It's a pink car. And after the pink car is held up, the owner will come in and praise her. So I want you to just pay attention to Katie's expressions, if you can.
Yay, good girl.
Okay, back to the Gary Larson cartoon, right? It's like no clue. It's inscrutable what she's thinking. Okay, and then this was the final condition. This blue light would signal that food, she's going to get a piece of food. And this food comes in on what we call the treat kebab. Because we don't want a human there, because that would mix up the conditions we're interested in. So, okay, so this is just like the hand signal experiment, except we now have these toys on the sticks, and we want to compare the toy that signals praise versus the one that signals food. And we're going to look in that same part of the brain, the caudate nucleus, so think of that as kind of a meter for how interested, how much they like those things. Now, it turned out to be a little bit more complicated than we thought, and this was really the first time that we had to go into what we call individual differences in dogs. So the more dogs that joined this project, the more I began to realize that dogs, like people, are individuals. And it very quickly became clear that it made no sense to just talk about dogs as like a generic category of animals. That the dogs were individuals, and that there were dogs, every dog had kind of their own likes and dislikes. And so their brain responses reflected that. So we had to do a behavioral test. This was actually one of the first behavioral tests we did, because we were trying to understand why some dogs had a higher response to the praise cue versus the food cue. So we gave them the Pepsi challenge. This was a giant, what we call V maze, set up in our training facility. The dog is behind that door, and then you'll see over here on the left, you see a little food bowl in yellow, and then on this side is the owner, seated kind of facing away from the door. And so the dog gets released, and they have to make a choice. Do I go for the food, or do I go for my owner? And they've already been familiarized with the setup, so it's not novel to them, so they know that there's a treat in the food bowl, and they know if they go to the owner, they get praise and a pet. And we do this 20 times for each dog, with switching sides each time. So let's see, this dog's name is Ohana.
Okay, praise.
Okay, happy dog, happy owner, great. Let's do it again. Okay, and look at her expression. So that was very typical. Again, it's not like dogs are just universally a way. And when we analyze, there are several ways you can analyze this. You can analyze it in terms of the proportion of responses to owner and food bowl. What actually turned out to be interesting was the strategy that dogs adopted. So some dogs were what we call samplers. They would go back and forth between food bowl and owner, and other dogs would just stick with one thing for a long time and then maybe switch. So the proportions and kind of their strategies actually is what was correlated with their brain response. And what we found in the brain response is that the majority of the dogs, over 3/4, had equal brain responses to the expectation of food and praise, meaning that they liked them both and they liked them both equally. And that manifested in the behavioral test as the dogs who sampled back and forth. So it's kind of like, it's like they're literally flipping a coin in their head, which one I go to. And then there was a subset of dogs who were higher in brain response to the expectation of praise, and those were the dogs that actually did go to their owners all the time. And then there was a couple dogs who really were all about the food, and their brains showed it, and their choices showed it. And the interesting thing is it was no surprise to the owners either. So they knew. Okay, so we come back to the question of love. So love is a highly loaded word. There are different types of love. If we're talking about humans, there's romantic love, there is parental love, there's platonic love. You can think of all sorts of types. So when it comes to human and dog relationships, everything that we're seeing suggests that, yes, there is something comparable, at least I would not call it romantic love, maybe more along the lines of a platonic love type relationship. And that for most of the dogs, I don't want to say all, because I often get this question of people ask me, does my dog love me? And my answer is, well, I don't know your dog and I don't know you. But I can say that the majority that we've seen kind of have evidence of these brain responses that do, in fact, show that they have things that are very much analogous that we have with each other. And so we'll end there and have time for maybe one or two questions. So thank you. Yes?
So did you find that it's breed related then, and also can you breed for...
So the question is, did we find any breed differences? And I can't answer the question because we have a lot of retrievers in the project because they're so popular, and there's so many breeds. But even kind of within a single breed, we still find a lot of variation. So it seems maybe there's some breed trends, but it seems much more of just individual variation. So, yes, sir?
Did you do any DNA studies for this particular breed? They're very good as therapy dogs, as he is a certified.
Right. So the question is, have we done any genetic studies? We are working on that. So we've partnered actually with a group called Canine Companions for Independence, CCI, which is based in Santa Rosa, and we are actively involved in looking for genetic markers. So, yeah. So, last question here.
As far as, you say they identify people better than objects, yet my dog can tell his driveway, and our driveway is not any different than another driveway, and he can turn right into them, so he must be able to see
Right. So,
objects as well.
yeah. So the question is, as I understand, we identify differences between faces and objects, and the question is kind of really about kind of how dogs navigate through the world. These are very difficult experiments to do because our environment in the MRI is very constrained by the tube and the fact that, you know, we're limited to things like showing visual things and objects and computer images. And when it gets out into real world space, we have no way of studying that because you can't scan a dog while they're navigating the real world. So anyway, I believe I'm out of time, so thank you.